Hi, welcome to the Mindful Healthcare Summit. I'm Dr. Hani Chabo. I'm a family doctor and mindfulness teacher. I love helping people change their lifestyle to reduce stress and live a life full of their fullest potential. I'm delighted to be your host today, interviewing a very special guest, Dr. Richie Davidson. We're going to dive into the science of well being and resilience with Dr. Davidson, who is one of the original pioneers of mindfulness neuroscience research, and learn practical tools from him to support us in this very challenging time. Dr. Davidson is a distinguished professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as founder and director for the for Healthy Minds. He is author of several books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Emotional Life of Your Brain, and numerous scientific papers on how to flourish as a human being. He was named by Time magazine as one of the world's top 100 most influential people. He's a longtime friend of the Dalai Lama and has been meditating for over 40 years and considers his practice not primarily for his benefit, but for the benefit of others. Dr. Davidson, what a great honor it is to have you with us today in the summit. Thank you for joining us.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So, in this summit, we're exploring how mindfulness, self compassion, and compassion practices can help support us as healthcare professionals in our work. At the best of times, serving as a healthcare professional is very demanding. And now, with all the challenges we're experiencing, it's really important, more than ever, that we find ways to cultivate our well being and resilience. Your work, Dr. Davidson, is amazing because it scientifically identifies four key pillars which support well being and prove that it's possible to learn and grow these qualities through even short practices. So, would you please start by sharing with us your definition of well being and resilience and explain to us your four pillars?
Certainly. Very happy to be here. Thank you for having me. We have developed a framework that guides much of the work we're doing now in our center for well-being and flourishing that represents the intersection of what we've learned from the great contemplative traditions about the core elements of well-being or flourishing that can be cultivated through practice, and what we also learn from modern science. And what the framework that we've developed consists of is the intersection of those two great traditions. One of the most important insights from modern science concerns plasticity of our brain, and also plasticity of our systemic biology, particularly epigenetics and the understanding that the regulation of our genes is something that is highly dynamic and can be influenced by our demeanor and by environmental circumstances and by our training. And so this framework brings together the insights from the contemplative traditions and from modern science and describes these four pillars. And I'll name the pillars, and then from that we can talk about what well-being means, what resilience might mean. The four pillars are these. The first we call awareness. Awareness is where we would include mindfulness, but it is something that is broader than just mindfulness. It includes our capacity to regulate our attention. It also includes what scientists call meta-awareness, which is knowing what our minds are doing. And this may seem a little bit odd to viewers, since many people might think that they always know what their mind is doing. But I think if we more deeply reflect on our everyday experience, many people, including myself, have had the experience, for example, of reading a book where we're reading each word on a page, and we may be reading one page, a second page, and after a few minutes we realize that we have no idea what we've just read. Our minds are somewhere else. that is an example of not knowing what our mind is doing, or a lapse in meta-awareness. The moment we recognize that we've been lost and bring our minds back to the present moment, that is a celebration, if you will, of meta-awareness. It is the operation of meta-awareness. So the awareness pillar includes our capacity to regulate our attention and capacity for meta-awareness. The second pillar we call connection. Connection is about qualities that promote healthy social relationships. Qualities like appreciation and gratitude and kindness and compassion. And research shows that every human being actually is born with what we call innate basic goodness. Young babies exhibit a preference for pro-social, altruistic encounters. But we learn to become more selfish. But if a young baby is given a choice, it will choose almost invariably the pro-social alternative. And so when we engage in practices to cultivate kindness or to cultivate compassion, we're not creating something de novo from nothing, but rather we are reminding ourselves, we're familiarizing ourselves with the basic nature, the intrinsic nature of our own mind. The third pillar of well-being we call insight. And insight here is about insight into the nature of the self-narrative, primarily, that all of us carry around. We all have this narrative, a set of thoughts, primarily about who we are, about the nature of this me. And a healthy relationship to this narrative is a key attribute of well-being. Not so much changing the narrative, but being able to see the narrative for what it is, which is really a constellation of thoughts. At the very extreme end of the distribution, there are people who have a very negative narrative, who have negative self-beliefs, and who actually hold those beliefs to be a true description of who they are. And of course, that's a prescription for depression. And finally, the fourth pillar of well-being is purpose. And purpose is about identifying your true north, the direction in which your life is headed, and particularly being able to find what psychologists have been calling a self-transcendent purpose. That is a purpose which goes beyond oneself, a purpose which may involve in one way or another benefiting others. And then being able to encompass more and more of our everyday lives within that sense of purpose. So each of these four pillars of well-being is really important. And what we have suggested is that human flourishing depends upon each of these four elements of well-being. And so we liken this to the following analogy. You would never go to the gym and just work out on your upper body. That would really, it would be helpful to your upper body, but after some time it might actually lead to some imbalance. And if you just worked on your mindfulness, for example, that would not be addressing all of the elements that we know are critical for well-being and may actually lead to some imbalance after some period of time. And so the cultivation of all four of these components in proper balance, we think, is really important for well-being. Now, you also asked about resilience, and then I'll stop. Resilience is something that emerges from the cultivation of all four of these qualities. It's not tied to any one. We know that each of these four pillars of well-being can make a contribution to resilience. And in fact, there are good empirical data to support that. And resilience we define essentially as the ability to bounce back from adversity, the rapidity with which we recover from adversity. The faster you recover from adversity, the more resilient you are. And we know that each of these 4 pillars of well-being contributes to that.
Lovely, lovely. And I love how simple it is encapsulated in these 4 pillars. Makes it so memorable. It's so profound, yet also so memorable in the setting of these 4 pillars. Wonderful. So you talk about well-being as a skill that can be learned and practiced. And traditionally, that's not something we learn in medical school. I know in my experience, I had to learn a lot of those concepts myself. And it really is so empowering to think of well-being in this way as a skill we can cultivate. In a little bit, I'm going to ask you to lead us through a guided meditation, which I'm super excited about. But for now, can you broadly touch on how each of these pillars is actually practiced?
Yes, there are practices in many of the contemplative traditions that target each of these 4 pillars of well-being. And they can be practiced in a completely secular way. By secular, we mean simply that they're really universal. They can be, I think, practiced by someone from any religious or spiritual tradition without it in any way being inconsistent with their own religious tradition. There are in the contemplative traditions, there are different classes of practices, some focused on attentional processes, others focused on what we've called more constructive processes, where you're actually cultivating certain qualities like compassion or kindness. And then there are other kinds of practices that we would call deconstructive, where they're meant to dismantle certain self-beliefs, for example, one of which is the belief in a kind of consistent, reified sense of self. And so we draw upon those different traditions and also supplement them with what we've learned from modern scientific research to come up with best practices, if you will, for each of these 4 pillars. And I should mention that we've put all of this into an app, which is freely available. The app has been developed by our nonprofit that's affiliated with our center. The nonprofit is called Healthy Minds Innovations, and the app is called the Healthy Minds Program. It can be downloaded anywhere in the world. And it goes.
Dr. Davidson, just to tell our viewers, we have that link underneath the video as well.
Thank you. So I would encourage viewers to explore this and to also become citizen scientists in the process. And there are measures included in the app that allow you to actually see how you're doing with each of these 4 pillars of well-being and track your changes over time, and through this also contribute to the growing corpus of scientific research in this area.
Wow, wonderful. So the fact that these 4 pillars can be cultivated with practice over time implies plasticity, and you've kind of mentioned that a little bit ago. I'm wondering if you'd share some of the research highlights and the transformations that happen in the body and in the brain as a result of practicing the 4 pillars over time, and what you think the implications for this are for us as a species.
Yeah, that's a great question, and also one that I can spend hours answering. And so I'll just offer a few snippets. The scientific evidence is most robust around awareness. There is a growing corpus of work around connection. There also is a very robust scientific literature on purpose. And I would say the area where there's the least scientific work is on insight, although it's there and it's growing. Just to give you a little bit of a taste of this, the awareness practices that strengthen attention and meta-awareness impact circuits that we know are important for the regulation of attention. These are circuits in the prefrontal cortex, the parietal cortex, and their interconnectivity. There are literally hundreds of scientific articles now showing that you can see changes on objective measures of attention and meta-awareness with even relatively modest amounts of practice. The most robust kind of scientific evidence is the kind of evidence where individuals who've never done any of these practices are taught these practices and then followed longitudinally for some period of time. And they're randomized to different groups. And then you can truly infer causality in showing that the practice of these methods is what was the active ingredient in producing the changes that are observed. We have also studied very long-term practitioners who've spent years cultivating their mind, and those data are really cool, and they show big differences, but ultimately they're not as scientifically satisfying because we really don't definitively know that it is through the practice that these qualities were cultivated. The skeptic can argue that maybe these people were different from the beginning. Maybe that's why they chose this path of intensive meditation practice. And we don't know. We do know that in many cases, the average number of lifetime hours of practice is associated with the magnitude of benefit that we can measure on, for example, these measures of attention or meta-awareness. Just moving on, with connection, there are different circuits in the brain that are impacted. There are circuits that are important for empathy, for the perception of others, for perspective taking. It's a totally different set of circuits. The idea that meditation, different forms of meditation do the same thing is simply misguided. Different forms of meditation will exert different effects on the mind and the brain. With insight practices, what we see are changes primarily in the connectivity of the brain. There is reason to expect that, because what the aspiration is with insight practices is not, again, to change the content of the self-related beliefs, but rather to change your relationship to that content. And it is in the process of transforming your relationship to that content that you alter the connectivity patterns of the brain. And particularly what we see is that there are elements of what neuroscientists refer to as the default mode, which is a mode of brain functioning that is essentially our baseline state. And what scientists have discovered is that when you just put a person in an MRI scanner and you give them the simple yet very complicated instruction to simply please rest without doing anything else, what most people do is they have all these self-related thoughts. And when they do that, there is a specific pattern of brain activity that emerges that's very lawful. And it turns out that there are at least certain nodes of this network that have altered connectivity with other parts of the brain as we develop insight. And finally, with purpose, one of the key things that's been found is as we strengthen our sense of purpose, and as that sense of purpose takes on this self-transcendent quality and embraces more and more of our everyday life, what we see transformed is our stress circuitry. This is where there's a lot of research which has focused particularly on resilience and showing that this stronger sense of purpose is associated with a more resilient profile where we recover more quickly from a stressful life event.
Wow. Wow, absolutely wonderful. And I love what you said about relating, how we relate to the thoughts, because a lot of difficulty I find when working with patients is I don't want to think positive all the time. I don't want to think positive all the time. I don't want to switch everything to positive. And really, it's about how you're relating to those thoughts, like being compassionate with yourself, tender with yourself. I love how you phrase that.
Right. One of the important messages is that this is not about fixing anything or changing anything. It really is simply about being with what is there. And through that process of acceptance and insight, your relationship to those thoughts and feelings are altered. And eventually, the thoughts and feelings will naturally change over time. But that's not the goal of the practice.
How wonderful. And how wonderful that there's so much science thanks to you and people that did work like yours also that made this so accessible in that way. So you talked about the dichotomy between whether meditating is what changes the brain or whether the people that approach meditation are already changed in a certain way, and that kind of provides some form of confusion there. But the Dalai Lama challenged you to conduct research on the effects of meditation in the brain. He said to you, you've been using the tools of modern neuroscience to mostly study anxiety, depression, and fear, all these negative feelings. Why can't you use these same tools to study qualities like kindness, compassion, and equanimity? And that was what you termed your wake-up call and catalyst. He then gave permission to his monks to have their brains studied at the University of Wisconsin, which is home to one of the most renowned brain labs in the world. And you flew in the monks from Tibet and Nepal. You asked them to meditate while you analyzed their brains under EEG, MRI, and fMRI scans. And when you first looked at the results, you said they were so shocking, you thought the equipment was malfunctioning. I'm sure you can talk about this for hours, but just for a few minutes, we'd all love to really hear about what did you see? What did the brains look like? And why were you so surprised?
Well, one of the first series of studies we did with these very long-term practitioners was to measure the electrical signals that we can record from the scalp surface. And what these signals displayed is high amplitude gamma oscillations. Gamma oscillations are very fast in frequency. They're around 40 cycles per second. We see this in a normal brain that's untrained, but when you see it in a normal brain, they're very, very brief, momentary epochs. They're periods of time that typically last less than 1 second, maybe a quarter of a second or a half a second. And they're associated with these brief moments of kind of aha experience or when different elements of a complex perception come together. They're very, very brief. But in these long-term practitioners, we saw these high amplitude gamma oscillations for minutes and minutes and minutes. And that's why we thought initially that something must be wrong with how we're doing these recordings, because this had never been seen in the human brain before. And so we spent about a year doing all these control conditions to rule out certain kinds of artifact and to establish that what we were observing was real. And we eventually convinced ourselves, and I believe the scientific community, that it's real. And so that was the start of this journey. And when we recognized that from a kind of scientific perspective, there was really a there. There's something robust here that is worth pursuing.
And it really pushes through that dichotomy, I think, when you see results like that. So, yeah. So, I'm really excited to ask you this right now because it would be such a treat to have you guide us through a meditation that moves through each of the four pillars so we can really get a taste of what you've been telling us about. Would you do us the honor?
I'm very happy to. Thank you for asking. So for viewers out there, I would encourage you for this practice to please close your eyes if you're comfortable with that, since we're in front of screens all the time. If you're more comfortable keeping your eyes open, that's fine too. Simply have a gentle gaze downward. And let's start by finding an upright but comfortable posture, not too tight, but not too loose. And begin by taking 1 or 2 deep breaths in and out, and simply letting go of whatever tension may be present in the body. And whenever we begin a period of practice, however short it might be, it's always helpful to remind ourselves why we're here, why we are engaging in these practices. And let's take a few moments to see if we can find within us not only a motivation for our own well-being, but recognizing that our well-being affects the well-being of all of those around us. Calming our mind and opening our heart will have ripple effects. So let's see if we can find within us this altruistic motivation, and recognizing that our own practice is not only for ourselves, but for all of those that we touch, directly or indirectly. And so let's now begin with awareness and bring our awareness first into our bodies. And simply noticing whatever sensations may be present. There's no need to fixate on any particular sensation. And also no need to change or fix anything. This is simply about awareness. And let's expand our awareness to all of our senses, whatever sounds we may be hearing, whatever visual impressions, even with our eyes closed, tactile, Also, any tastes and smells. Literally anything can support our awareness. And as we're resting in this awareness, let us bring into our mind and our heart a person who has been helpful to us during this time of the pandemic. It could be the person we live with. It could be our spouse. It may be a child. It may be a delivery person. It may be a healthcare provider. Whoever it might be. Let's bring this person into our mind and our heart. And let's see if we can find this sense of appreciation for who they are and all that they are doing. And maybe even reflecting on how we may express our gratitude to them the next time we see them. And now let's bring our awareness to our beliefs and expectations about some important event or situation. It may be some situation at work. It may be an interpersonal situation. It may be some kind of activity in our daily life. See if you can bring to mind a recent situation and bring into awareness the beliefs and expectations that you have about that situation. And let's reflect on how those beliefs and expectations may be influencing our experience of that situation. And how might we experience that situation differently if we let go of those beliefs and expectations? And by let go, we don't mean changing them, but simply noticing they may be there but no longer having them hijack our experience. How might we respond differently? What might be different in our experience? And now let's move on to purpose. And let's reflect now on the values that are important to you, whatever those values might be. And see if we can find within those values ones that benefit not only ourselves, but also may benefit others. And let's reflect on how the activities in which you are engaged may somehow support and embody these values. And see if you can envision how even the simple routine activities of daily living may all be part of this core sense of purpose that you have. And as we transition out of this period of formal practice, as we typically do when we end a period of practice, is to dedicate whatever merit or whatever insight, whatever learning we may have gleaned from this short period of practice together, and reflect on how we can bring it out into the world to benefit others. So for those of you whose eyes have been closed, please open them now. And we can re-engage, instilled with this quality of presence that maybe you tasted during this period. So thank you.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Thank you so much.
Always happy to practice.
The beliefs and expectations part really spoke to me. Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. So, just to bring our time to an end, I'm wondering if you have any practical advice about how to cultivate these qualities, especially now with everything that's going on. People have so many responsibilities to juggle, and people have limited times. Are there still ways to cultivate the skill of well being in that setting?
Yeah, that's a super important question, and I appreciate being asked it. This is a really challenging time. It is challenging in so many different ways. And it is, I think, very natural that people are feeling quite stressed by what's happening. Um, I also think that it is a period that is ripe with possibility because I think most of us would agree that the trajectory of the world pre-pandemic was not a particularly healthy or sustainable one. And I think this pandemic has given us the opportunity to stop our worlds and reflect and recognize this, and hopefully we can glean some insights which will enable the post-pandemic world to look different from the pre-pandemic world. Now, having said all that, one of the things I frequently remind people is that when human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And I'll bet you every viewer who's watching this brushes their teeth at least once and probably more than once a day. And this is not part of our genome. This is something that we've learned to do. And the whole species has learned this because we recognize it's something that is good for our physical hygiene. What we're talking about is something good for our mental hygiene. And I think most viewers would agree that our minds are even more important than our teeth. And if we spent even as short a time as we spend brushing our teeth, nourishing our mind, this world would really be a different place. So that's how we can start. And one of the things that we offer people in our app is that you can do these practices while you're engaged in other activities of daily living. You don't need to take a single minute extra out of your day. You can do it while you're brushing your teeth. You can do it while you're commuting. You can do it while you're walking. You can do it while you're engaged in physical exercise. You can do it while you're cleaning the house. So it is possible to piggyback these mental practices on top of other activities of daily living. And it's really important to do this with regularity. So even short amounts of time is great as long as it is done with regularity. And so what I would encourage viewers to do is take a 30-day challenge. Figure out what the most minimal time is that you can allocate to these kinds of practices each day, understanding that you can do this while you're doing something else, so you don't have to take any extra time. And even if it's just 2 or 3 minutes a day, see if you can do that every single day for 30 days. And that's how you can start. And in that way, change happens. The other thing to recognize during the pandemic is that the public health recommendations that are made by our experts, for example, to physically distance, when we do that, we're doing it not just for ourselves, we're doing it for the benefit of others. And so embracing that altruistic intent is really important in helping us to conform to these public health recommendations and do it with grace and with equanimity. And that can be part of the practice as well. So it's really simple, but it does take a lot of reminders to get this going as a regular part of our everyday life. But the fact that you all brush your teeth is testament that you all could do it.
Yeah. Very, very wise words, Dr. Davidson. Thank you so much for that. Really, when we change ourselves, we also change the world. And I highly encourage our viewers to you start using that app. It's definitely a place to start for sure. So thank you so much for this truly illuminating session and sharing your profound work with us. And thank you for our viewers for tuning in. I'm sure I learned so much during this, and I'm sure everybody watching learned as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Take care.